Let's bring the witness back on. Okay, please be seated. Mr. Frank, you may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. Professor Stoughton, let me start out this way. In assessing or arriving at your opinion about whether the use of deadly force was reasonable, proportional in this case, did you attempt to identify any threat of imminent great bodily harm or death?
Yes.
And were you able to identify any potential such threats?
Certainly risk, yes.
Explain.
So from my review of the evidence, Sergeant Johnson entered or leaned his torso into Mr. Wright's vehicle and stayed in that position for approximately 8 seconds. An officer who overextends themselves by putting themselves into someone's vehicle certainly has the potential, if the vehicle begins moving, to be dragged, ejected, seriously injured, killed, run over by the vehicle, or the like. That's always a risk. As I talked about earlier, it doesn't become a threat until there's ability, opportunity, and intention, but it's always a risk of reaching into a vehicle.
And so in determining whether that risk was an actual threat from a reasonable officer in Officer Potter's position, did you look at evidence from the case itself?
Yes, of course.
And in doing that, is evidence of conduct, actual conduct of the officer, corroborative? Does it corroborate what a reasonable officer in that officer's position would have known?
Yes, absolutely. So, for example...
Excuse me, Your Honor, can you answer the question?
Okay. All right. All right. The objection is sustained.
Would an example help explain your testimony?
I think so.
Okay. Tell us what the example is then, please.
So, for example, if there are the sound of gunshots on a video, like an officer's body-worn camera video, and the question is whether the reasonable officer in that situation would have perceived that those gunshots were actual gunshots or a car backfiring or a nearby television or something like that, you look at the actions of the people around, including the actions of the officer, to help figure out what conclusions the reasonable officer on the scene would have drawn. If, for an example, with that same example, if the officer remains standing casually leaned against a wall with their arms crossed and really doesn't react, it would tend to suggest that the reasonable officer in that situation would not draw the conclusion that those were actual gunshots that merited an immediate response, for example.
So in evaluating whether this risk created by Officer Johnson's conduct had become an imminent threat, did you consider the conduct of Officer Potter?
I did, and particularly the question as to whether it would have been perceived as by the reasonable officer in Officer Potter's position as an imminent threat. Yes.
And what conduct did you consider, and explain how that affected your opinion?
Sure. In summary, the conduct that is relevant is conduct immediately before and during the shooting itself, and then immediately after the shooting. So with a little bit more particularity, the conduct before the shooting is Officer Potter's apparent decision to use the taser. She threatens twice, "I'll tase you, I'll tase you." She draws a weapon that is her sidearm, her firearm. She gives taser warnings, which is taser, taser, taser. That's in small part a warning to the subject, but it's really a warning to other officers that there's about to be a taser discharge. And then she pulled the trigger of the firearm, aiming it in the area of Mr. Wright's chest. Immediately after the shooting, Officer Potter indicates that was not what she meant to do. She says something to the equivalent of, "Oh shit, I shot him, I drew the wrong gun, or I pulled the wrong gun, I shot him." And then in the next few minutes...
I object to any more of his narrative regarding what you said after that, as indicating something.
The objection is overruled. You may continue.
Thank you, Your Honor. In the next few minutes, there are additional indications that Officer Potter, at least, or rather, there are additional behaviors that would indicate that a reasonable officer in her position at the time would not have perceived that there was an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm, most especially her statements about going to prison, indicative that there was a lack of justification for the use of deadly force.
And is there additional indications there at the scene involving what I would like to call backdrop when she actually fired?
Yes. So immediately before the time she pulled the trigger and shot, Officer Lucky was standing immediately to her right and extending over, sort of reaching into the open driver's side door. There was obviously a passenger in the car. And until the time Officer Potter began saying taser, 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 we have that 8-second period of Sergeant Johnson leaning his torso into the vehicle as well. In other words, we're talking about a number of potential targets that could be struck with a bullet in very close proximity. It's generally accepted in policing that officers actually miss their target more often than they hit, so they have to be very aware of what's immediately around their target. It's also well known that bullets can overpenetrate, so officers have to be very aware of what's immediately behind their target. Putting that together, the indication of the putting together the behavior indicating the intention to use a taser, and the rationale that would militate against firearms use, reasonable officer in that situation would not have believed that there was an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm, or maybe a little bit more precisely, those actions are certainly not consistent with the actions of a reasonable officer who perceived an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm.
Now, we've been talking about, well, let me back up just a bit. We've heard some testimony about hollow point bullets. Are you familiar with them?
Yes, I am.
And what is at least one of the purposes of a hollow point type bullet?
A hollow point bullet has a small indentation, on the front that causes the head of the bullet to expand, or it's sometimes called to mushroom, when it penetrates especially soft target, like bodily tissue. There are a couple of different reasons for that. One is to increase the stopping power, the actual kinetic power of the bullet. To the more surface area it takes up, the more kinetic energy it transfers from the bullet that's moving into the body of the person, as opposed to what's called a fully jacketed bullet, which has a shell around the lead of the bullet that just might pierce through someone. So one reason for a hollow point bullet is to have more what's referred to as stopping power. Another reason is to reduce the likelihood of overpenetration. When the bullet expands, the idea is it will stop sooner than a different round, a non-hollow point round.
And you talked about one of the concerns of firing the weapon, the gun, in this case. Would the fact that Officer Potter fired a hollow point bullet have ensured that it would not have presented a danger to others in that immediate area?
No, absolutely not. Hollow point bullets are a pretty standard issue in policing. There are still overpenetration issues in police shootings. And of course, if a hollow point bullet hits a relatively small target, like the muscles of the upper arm, for example, it's probably not going to stop. In fact, it's almost certainly not going to stop there. It's going to overpenetrate. And of course, if it misses the intended target and hits another target, well, then the fact that it's a hollow point doesn't help you at all.
All right, so I want to explore this issue about Sergeant Johnson being in the vehicle a little further. And I want to have you assume, for purposes of this part of the analysis, that a reasonable officer in Officer Potter's position was aware that Sergeant Johnson was in the vehicle to some extent, okay?
Okay.
All right. And I'm going to put up on the screen what's been received as Exhibit 63. And I'm going to ask you just to pause it for a minute, Mr. Miller, and could you freeze this video at the timestamp of 2:01:52, please? And if you want to just go right to it, that's fine. Go a little further, please. All right, so that's fine. Are you familiar with this video?
I am, yes.
Okay, does this appear to be Sergeant Johnson's body-worn camera video?
Yes, it does.
And we've stopped it at 2:01:52. Are you able to determine what Sergeant Johnson is doing with his right hand at this time?
Yes, Sergeant Johnson appears to be reaching for the shifter with his right hand.
And you've watched the video. Does he eventually succeed at putting his hand on that video?
Yes, he does.
And then if you could, Mr. Miller, just let this run to 2:01:54, please.
Excuse me, Your Honor, I object to his narration of an exhibit and what he perceives it to be.
All right.
Sorry.
The objection is overruled. I'll let you answer.
So again, if you could just run that through 2:01:54, please. Do you see Mr. Wright's hands there?
Yes, I do. Or at least what appears to be his right hand.
And he is trying to move the shift knob?
Yes.
And does Officer or Sergeant Johnson prohibit that, to keep it from happening?
Yes, he does.
And then if you could run this to 20200, please.
Just stay back.
And if you can just click it a little bit further, please. Now, at this point, can you see what Sergeant Johnson is doing?
Yes, I can.
And are you able to see Sergeant Johnson's, what do you perceive him as doing in this situation, Sergeant Johnson?
As Officer Potter says, taser, 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 Sergeant Johnson's torso is coming back and out of the front passenger side door. His feet are on the ground there. Both of his hands are on the passenger, or at least in the direction of the passenger. I can't make out from this frame exactly what he's holding.
And does he appear to have hold of Mr. Wright?
I don't. I'd have to watch the video. I'm not sure whether he's holding Mr. Wright's hand there as the fingers, or I believe those are Mr. Wright's fingers, but I'd have to watch it to make completely sure.
So during this course of events, was Mr. Wright able to drive the vehicle?
Not with Sergeant Johnson preventing the vehicle from driving, as evidenced by the fact that the vehicle didn't move until later.
And so in your opinion, if a reasonable officer in Officer Potter's position had been aware of these facts that we've just seen regarding Officer Johnson, would it have been reasonable and proportional for an officer to use deadly force on Mr. Wright there?
No, not at this point. There was certainly some risk while Mr. Wright was scrambling for the shifter to put the car in gear. Once Sergeant Johnson has backed out of the vehicle and is no longer at risk of being dragged or carried away or anything like that, then there is no threat to him of the vehicle moving at that point.
And if you could let this run to 20201, please. Now, at this point, can you see Sergeant Johnson's position?
Yes.
And where is he located at that time?
Sergeant Johnson is physically outside of the vehicle except for his hands, which are still maybe slightly inside the vehicle. His feet are outside the vehicle. It would appear from the frame his shoulders are outside of the vehicle.
In your opinion, if a reasonable officer in Officer Potter's position and was aware that the warnings about the taser caused Sergeant Johnson to back out of the vehicle, would it have been reasonable and proportional for an officer at that time to use deadly force?
No, it would not have been proportional because there is no longer an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm to Sergeant Johnson. He's at no threat of being dragged by the vehicle once he's out of the vehicle.
So in order to have used deadly force when the shot was fired, a reasonable officer in Officer Potter's position would have had to know that Sergeant Johnson was in the car, correct?
Yes.
That a reasonable officer in Officer Potter's position would have not been able to perceive that Sergeant Johnson had prevented Mr. Wright from moving the car?
That's correct. The reasonable officer would have had to mistakenly believe that Sergeant Johnson was, that there was still a threat that the vehicle could move at that point.
And the reasonable officer in Officer Potter's position would have had to fail to perceive that Sergeant Johnson had actually backed out of the vehicle.
That's correct. A reasonable officer in Officer Potter's position would have had to mistake that Sergeant Johnson was still in the vehicle and not in the position that he was shortly before and at the time the shot was fired.
Is there information in this case regarding whether a reasonable officer in Officer Potter's position would have had some awareness of Sergeant Johnson's position or not?
There is evidence that leads me to conclude that a reasonable officer in Officer Potter's position would not have been aware of that.
And what is that evidence?
There are a combination of factors. First, officers, the reasonable officer would not assume that another officer had physically entered a vehicle to that extent. There's a great deal of training and guidance to officers to not reach for shifters or keys or the like. So a reasonable officer certainly wouldn't expect another officer to do so. Second, if a reasonable officer did perceive that there was some imminent threat of death or great bodily harm as by being dragged, in other words, that deadly force was justified, what you would expect to see is an officer preparing to deploy a deadly force option, that is to, for example, potentially use a firearm there. Officers are generally trained that they should draw their firearms in anticipation of having to use them if you see an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm coming. That is, if there's a risk that could manifest or could evolve into an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm, you generally draw your firearm because lesser force options may not be sufficient to actually address that threat. And then on the back end, Officer Potter's behavior would indicate that the reasonable officer in her position would not have perceived that deadly force had been justified. If you perceive that deadly force is justified, well, then using deadly force is always some cause for concern and deliberation, but not consistent with the behavior that we see.
And had anybody indicated, verbalized that they were going to enter the car?
No, there was no verbal statement from Sergeant Johnson that he was in the car. There was no verbalization from Officer Lucky or from Officer Potter that Sergeant Johnson was in the car. Nothing from Mr. Wright or the passenger in his car.
Is there information regarding a reasonable officer in Officer Potter's position to have seen Officer or Sergeant Johnson?
Yes. So although you shouldn't mistake the perspective of a body-worn camera for being exactly the perspective of an officer. There can be differences. That is, a body-worn camera will see more than an officer sees, mostly because an officer's vision, like all human vision, is somewhat limited in focus, and on a body-worn camera, everything's in focus. But for the vast majority of the approximately 8 seconds that Sergeant Johnson was in the car, you can't really make that out at all on Officer Potter's body-worn camera footage. It's not at all uncommon. In fact, it's pretty typical in dynamic situations like this for officers to not keep as close track of each other as they might ideally like to. In this case, for example, Sergeant Potter didn't know what Officer Lucky was doing right on the other side of the car.
The objection is sustained on that, and the jury will disregard that last statement.
Your Honor, may I be heard on that, please?
Yes. To the jury, I'm going to let you go to lunch right now, and we'll get started up again at 1:30. Okay? Okay, the reason I sustain the objection is that this witness cannot testify as to what Officer Potter was aware of. He just can't do that. He can't say she wouldn't have been aware, she wouldn't have been aware that he was in danger or something, because he doesn't have any foundation for that. What he can testify to is whether a reasonable officer in Officer Potter's position would have done, but not testify as to what she was aware of. Okay.
And Your Honor, I have to admit I didn't hear exactly what Professor Stoughton was saying that drew the objection. So, but what I was trying to elicit from him is that Sergeant Johnson testified that he was not aware of what Lucky was doing. And I think the witness may have misspoke and used Officer Potter's name instead.
Okay.
But what I'm asking here, and experts are not sequestered for this very purpose, Johnson testified to that, so it's relevant to what the other side of the car would have. That's the point.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't. His opinions are fine if he's looking at the evidence and drawing conclusions based upon what a reasonable officer would have done under the circumstances. Okay. So, all right. I think that takes care of that. Why don't we break for lunch and start up again at 1:30, okay? Unless Mr. Gray wants to be heard further. Did you want to be heard further? Okay. All right.